Mr. Michael attacks bin Laden is now dead, obviously. What does this mean for US national security? Is the US safer now that bin Laden is dead, or is it more susceptible to terrorist attacks?
I don't want to at all denigrate the success in killing Osama bin Laden. I think it was very important. I think he was a very talented man, and certainly what they've leaked about him shows he was still in command of basically Afghanistan. They're now in Yemen, Somalia, Iraq, North Africa, in Palestine to some extent, and in the Levant. So it's hard for me to understand how people base their argument that somehow a bigger and more geographically dispersed organization can be weaker. In fact, I think part of the genius of bin Laden was seen in the dispersal of the organization. He made sure that his death would not be the end of the group.
So you think that the death of bin Laden might affect the motivations of the group?
I think several things, but most of all, I think it depends on how the succession works. Ayman Zawahiri is not the most popular man in Al-Qaeda. He's, although the information we have about him is dated, he's a very abrasive, avuncular man who never ceases to remind people that he's an Egyptian and they've been there for 4,000 years. That said, there is a talented group of people to follow bin Laden eventually. Abu Yahya al-Libi is a very talented man, well-credentialed as an Islamic scholar. The leader in the Arab Peninsula, Abu Ayyashi, is a very, very talented man as both a fighter and a politician. So I think it's a mistake to assume that bin Laden was, his death ends the problem. In fact, the recruiting sergeants for Al-Qaeda are David Cameron, Osama bin Laden, or Barack Obama, Nicolas Sarkozy. That's the recruiting mechanism for Al-Qaeda, because they stick to foreign policies that alienate so much of the Muslim world.
Absolutely. But in terms of what has been achieved by the killing of Osama bin Laden, what do you think has been achieved?
I think what's been achieved is substantively the removal of a very talented individual who was focusing his efforts on the United States, and a man who articulated, whether we like to agree or not, or whether we agree with Al-Qaeda's military action, he articulated the position of what the polling shows to be 80% of the Muslim world. They regard Western foreign policy as an attack on their faith and on their brethren. That doesn't mean that all of those people are going to pick up guns. But we're in such a state of denial in the West about why we're being attacked that I don't know how this is going to end up, but I think it can only get worse.
I mean, Osama bin Laden was not exactly the epitome of Islam or Muslims. He wasn't a representative of mainstream Islam in any way. I mean, if we read the Quran, it says that you should not kill.
Yeah.
It says the same in the Torah, it says the same in the Bible. So he's definitely not an...
He's not a mainstream Muslim, but he's not a renegade either. You know, he's a very clearly falls within the Salafi camp of Islam. And although that's not the mainstream, it is a growing sect, and it is a sect which, as I understand, is very respected for its asceticism and for its devotion to the Prophet and to the Quran. I think that's the other point I would make, is that the West has become so ignorant of its own history that we forget that any religion historically that feels itself under attack or cornered responds violently. Not just Islam. The Catholic Church, the Protestant churches, the Israeli, the Jewish community. It's just part of the way people work. And was bin Laden a representative of Islam whole? No. But he was a representative of grievances, the personification of them. And someone, when no Muslim government is willing to stand up, who was willing not only to stand up but to strike a blow for what he believed in. So I think he was a very important figure.
But in many ways, this example of Osama bin Laden, this demonization of this individual, and in many ways the religion, it really affected and hindered the perception of Muslims, particularly within Europe. I mean, there's this growing idea, and there's this growing idea of Islamophobia now as a result of 9/11 and these ideas of Muslims as terrorists. What
Yeah.
do you think of them?
Again, I think those are primarily generated by two things. First, the leaders of the West harping constantly on the hatred for freedom and liberty and gender equality and all that kind of stuff that doesn't, it makes no sense. You know, just no common sense. How many Muslims are there in the world that are going to blow themselves up because my daughters go to university? 3, 4, not even a nuisance. But they've misidentified the motivation of the people who are fighting us, and they've really demonized. If they're, you know, you can understand demonizing bin Laden. He's an enemy. You demonize your enemies. But I'm not sure the Western politicians have a handle on how badly they've disturbed the social balance in Europe and the United States, increasingly in the United States.
Exactly. I mean, it's had an enormous effect, particularly in Europe. We've seen growing legislations in Switzerland, in
Yes.
France. So it's had a very detrimental effect on the way Muslims are perceived.
It has indeed. And also the fact that it's stretched on for so long. You know, I think the next problem is going to be under Mr. Obama, Mr. Cameron, Mr. Sarkozy, especially Mrs. Clinton, that the Muslim world will perceive a cultural war against them. If you read what Mr. Obama said last week and what he and Cameron said this week, they're going to tell the Muslim world how to treat women, how to hold elections, how to allow religious freedom. They sound like they're out bushing Bush, you know. And so I think it's funny because so many people, at least in my country, in the United States, they write that Muslims are trying to impose their culture on us. And it's just the opposite. The cultural war is being waged against, look at Afghanistan.
Exactly.
We're trying to tell the Afghans that they have to have so many seats in parliament for women, that they can't have tribal cultures anymore, that it's an insane thing. You know, when you decide to go to war for your values, and you're going to fight a people who don't share those and don't want them, you're going to have to kill an enormous number of people.
Exactly. So it was an imposition of Western values on a country, a very much tribalized country like Afghanistan, and that's one of the failures, I think, of the war.
It's not only a failure, but it's a cause of more wars. And what it also is a failure of the Western educational system, at least the United States educational system. Our country was founded by men who said, stay out of other people's wars because you won't understand them.
Exactly.
And you will,
non-interventionist
right,
route.
and you will sacrifice freedoms at home by going into wars of other people. And that's exactly what's happened. How we get around that, I don't know. Let's just listen to Obama and Cameron.
This would be
The Anglo-Saxon world is going to go to teach Muslims how to be good little Westerners.
we look forward to that. In relation,
And you know, they don't have a clue.
sorry?
They don't have a clue, really, about what a pagan culture they're presiding over and how a religious people could honestly resent the idea that the way women are treated in Hollywood is the way women should be treated. You know, they don't have a clue about that.
Absolutely. I mean, in relation to US-Pakistan relations,
Yes.
particularly in terms of the discovery of bin Laden in Pakistan, how do you think, do you believe that the Pakistani government was complicit in hiding bin Laden? And how do you think this affects US-Pakistani relations?
I don't know if they were. My suspicion was that someone in the intelligence service or the military knew where he was since 9/11. But I think what you saw in our reaction was the adolescent belief that everyone's interests are the same as ours. It was never in Pakistan's interest, national interest, to turn over Osama bin Laden to the United States or to be responsible for killing him. And we couldn't accept that, or we didn't recognize it. It was clear from the start. And I don't blame the Pakistanis. The Pakistanis have, because they've helped us, they have a civil war on their own country. But in the long run, all of the criticism of Pakistan, is just hot air. The relationship will continue because with 130,000 NATO troops in Afghanistan, there's no way to supply them if the Pakistanis don't let us use Karachi Harbor and then truck the material into Afghanistan. You know, so it's in many ways it's play acting. It's for public consumption because the Pakistanis really have the whip hand. No Karachi, no army. We have to withdraw because we can't fly enough stuff in.
So really they have the upper hand.
They have the upper hand then. Absolutely the case. We've stranded an army in Afghanistan, and we depend on the Pakistanis to be able to supply it.
There's been a lot of speculation that he was armed, he wasn't armed
Yeah.
at the time of the killing. Can you talk to us a bit about that? And to what extent do you think the US operation defied the rule of law? Was it right for them to dispose of Osama bin Laden as soon as they found them,
To kill him?
supposedly dump him in the sea?
Yeah, I think, let me say two things. First, I think the operation was really a very professionally done one, and I think the aftermath was really botched politically. They can't get their story straight to this day, 3 weeks later. And also, I think it displays a continuing level of ignorance about Islam at the highest levels of our government. You know, the claim that they would have built a shrine to him, his own followers would have tore down any shrine or pilgrimage to his burial site. You know, the Salafis are hell on wheels when it comes to shrines or
Very
saints.
much opposed.
Very much opposed. Well, even in Saudi Arabia, they tear down the houses that they think the Prophet may have been in, so that it doesn't become a shrine. So they were very ill-informed, and to bury him at sea is another kind of example, I think, of a gratuitous mistake. As I understand it, a Muslim is buried at sea only if he dies at sea, and there's a health threat. So it was really a very amateurish handling of the aftermath of it. In terms of what the operation was, obviously the rules of engagement had been changed, because generally American intelligence and military people have to be shot at before they return fire. So my own view, and that's all it is that they preferred not to bring him back.
Why?
Well, I think they were right. We didn't want him speaking in a courtroom, whether a military court or a civil court, to the Muslim world. He was going to be convicted no matter what court he was in, and he was going to become, in some ways, more of a martyr than he was now. And also, the United States of America has proven it doesn't know how to handle prisoners of war. So, had we brought him back to this country, to America, the American Civil Liberties Union and other kind of groups on the left would have been arguing for a trial or his release or something. So I think, because we are in so many ways incapable of acting as adults, that probably they decided that was the best thing to do.
Right, dispose of them.
Well, not dispose of the body,
dispose
but
of
not
it.
bring him back alive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In relation to the recent Arab Spring that's involved the Middle East and
Yes.
North Africa, what is your opinion? To what extent will these revolutions pave a way for democratic nation states? And do you think this is possible?
I think democracy is possible everywhere, but I don't think it can be imposed, and I don't think it comes immediately. Had Americans known their own history, George Bush's argument that we could democratize Iraq would have been laughed out of court, but we don't know our own history. America has been at this with Britain for 800 years. We don't have it perfect yet, and to expect it to be duplicated in a country, in places where fundamentally there's not a difference between church and state is really a silly notion. I also think that the Western media, when they were in Tahrir Square, for example, maybe in total they talked to 200 Egyptians, well-groomed, educated, English-speaking, pro-Western, pro-democracy. And then they read their Facebooks and their Twitters, and they extrapolated that sample to 85 million Egyptians.
That's definitely not representative.
It's worse than polling. I mean, polling isn't great all the time, but this is ridiculous. The journalists became cheerleaders. And to me, to expect a Muslim nation to reach out for a foreign ideology that many of them consider irreligious or even pagan is kind of counterintuitive. I don't think that you're going to have Osama bin Laden or an extreme version of the Muslim Brotherhood, but the one thing that I think polling does show is that Muslims, men and women, militants and non-militants, old and young, want some measure of Sharia within their governmental organization. And to expect that not to be the case, I think, is crazy.
I'm not sure if that's the case with every Muslim country or Middle Eastern country. There should definitely be a difference between government and your religion. It should be separated in that sense.
Well, I think there is people who believe that, but I think there's also people who believe that Islam is the foundation of law and government, and I don't think that's a bad thing. It was that way in the West forever. And are we better off without it? Look around. I'm not sure. But whatever happens is not going to be what Obama and Mrs. Clinton and Sarkozy and Cameron expect. And what are they going to do then? They didn't like the dictators. And what if you get a government that's half Muslim Brotherhood, half democratic, and part military? Are we going to go and ruin that government then until we get the right one?
That was my next question in terms of the vacuum of power that's now left. Do you think there's a mountain fear that Islamist groups will try to fill this void? Do you think this is possible?
Without a doubt. I think it's really been extraordinary to watch. Let me start. For 30 years, Western foreign policy in the Muslim world depended on the maintenance of tyranny for access to oil, to protect the Israelis, and so the tyrants would clamp down on the Islamists and kill them or incarcerate them. We're now in the really odd position of watching the West cheerlead for the destruction of its policy with nothing else to go to. In common sense, I think, or history at least, shows that in places where there is chaos, uncertainty, worries, just anarchy, the people with the greatest advantage are people with organization. And whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood, whether it's Al-Qaeda, whether it's Ennahda in Tunisia, they do have organization. And so they will have a part to play in the political process. And maybe a big one simply because in Egypt, clearly Mr. El-Baradei doesn't have an organization. He has some supporters, he has some media, but he doesn't have a 50-year-old organization supporting him. So I think chaos always favors the organized. And
it doesn't matter whether this is religiously inspired or
no,
inspired by Western.
I'm sure there are groups, non-Islamist groups in the Muslim world who are also well organized. But to me, the groups that reflect the culture most genuinely and are well organized have the advantage.
Because like you said, when we saw the uprisings and the interviews, it was a very small sample.
Extraordinary.
So that's not really representative of the needs and the
desires
behind those revolutions. So
in all the talk about the social media, I think in Egypt 57% of the people are illiterate. So how do you know what they're thinking? I think the question is, will the governing elite of the United States be willing to work with them? And I have my doubts, because they equate Islamist with terrorist. And they also say any Islamist government would be bad for Israel, and Israel is our hero or bribes our congressman or whatever. So what I would worry about, I tend to think that an Islamist government in Egypt would be far less brutal and far less fascist than Mubarak.
Absolutely.
It seems
I think anybody's less fascist.
Yeah, I think in Saudi Arabia, if Osama bin Laden had become to power, he would have been much less brutal, bloody-minded than the Al Sauds were. So I've never been one that was afraid of an Islamist government simply because it was Islamist. It doesn't have to be your enemy. I think it's going to take time to become a friend, because we're not going to be trusted because of the way our policies have unfolded over the past half century.
Obviously, there's a growing mistrust amongst Muslims in the region towards Western policy.
Absolutely. If Muslims were listening to Mr. Obama this week, he sounds more Bush than Bush, except he says that he's better spoken and he's probably a little smarter. But he called for regime change in 6 countries. You know, Bahrain, Yemen, Palestine, Syria, Libya, and Iran. You know, if Bush had made that speech and then come to London, he would have been stoned.
Absolutely.
But Obama, because he's this nice, bright, you know, articulate man, was treated as some kind of a conquering hero.
What's the future of Israel in the region now with the ongoing revolutions?
It's a very interesting thing to watch, because as they cheer the destruction of first Saddam and then Mubarak, what they've done, what the West has done, is take the outer shields away from Israel. Mubarak kept the border with Gaza closed. He was willing to kill Egyptians who wanted to go in to help the Palestinians.
The border is
now open. And as long as Saddam was in power, Saddam was, he diddled around with the Palestinians and he paid off martyrs' families and all of that. But the real hardcore Salafi jihadis, he kept out of the Levant. Once we shattered Saddam, we have now a greater presence of the Salafis and Al-Qaeda in Jordan, in Syria, in northern Lebanon, if the Israelis are telling the truth, in Palestine. So I would think that what the neoconservatives have done, what the Jewish leaders of the United States have done, is really endanger the security of Israel. Because ultimately, you might be able to intimidate Assad with a nuclear weapon, but you can't stop border infiltration.
So what do you think is the future? Do you think there's a possible attack?
On the Israelis?
Yes.
I think they'll have increasing problems with border control. I think that demonstration on the Syrian border is an evidence of what's going to come. My own view is Israel is of no value to the United States, economically, materially, but then again, neither is Palestine. This is a problem of the region. The Israelis and the Arabs have to work this out one way or another. It's not in the United States' interest to become involved in either side. Why not let, Obama talks and Bush talked a lot about self-determination. Sometimes self-determination, like Mao said, comes out of the barrel of a gun. And ultimately, we're not going to stop this problem.
So you don't think there's a need for American intervention?
No. I think, indeed, my own view is that for both the Palestinians and the Israelis, the Americans are what keeps this going in some ways, because they know the Americans will always step in if anybody goes too far. If that wasn't there, maybe they would have to act like adults and try to settle the problem. Or they might fight it out to the death. Either way, it's not an effect on the United States. If Israel disappears tomorrow, if Palestine disappears tomorrow, or they both disappear, there's no impact on American life here.
I mean, if there's no impact on American life, why is there an ongoing, well, there's a supposed special relationship between the two countries?
I think it's mostly
and
corruption.
This obviously affects Muslim opinion across the region.
Absolutely. When Obama was here preaching all of this good stuff for the Muslim world, Netanyahu was talking to a joint session of Congress and they gave him 29 standing ovations. And while Obama was speaking, Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya were televising Netanyahu's speech to the Muslim world. What's the ordinary person going to think? That no matter what Obama says, they're going to side with Israel every time. So I think it's a terrible. Look at how they've demonized Turkey. Turkey, who has been a far more important, a far more cooperative ally than the Israelis ever have been, because of that flotilla thing, the American media is demonizing the Turks now.
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of Turkey, what do you think the role of Turkey would be with the recent uprisings? Do you think it can play a big role?
I frankly don't know.
Model?
I don't know enough about Turkey. I tend to think that while bin Laden was alive, Turkey was one of his worst nightmares. An Islamic country maintaining its faith and yet executing a democratic system. So I think he was probably more afraid of the Turkish model than any other thing that we could dream up. How it goes over the longer term, I think young Muslims will be affected, whether they're in Turkey or America or Canada, by the impact of Western foreign policy. In Turkey especially, because it is the most democratic country in the region, has to respect the views of its people.
In terms of the importance of this very important natural resource that is oil, obviously it's the driving force for many of the wars that we've been experiencing. If America wasn't so reliant on the resources from the Gulf, do you think it would be intervening in the region as much? Or?
Certainly on the Arab Peninsula, there's nothing that's worth the life of an American Marine except for oil. And the American Congress has been negligent to the brink of criminality by wasting 40 years since the first embargo to do something about our dependence on oil from the Middle East. I think oil is a tremendous problem, energy, and really America is stuck in the Middle East until it does something about oil. Until we become more self-sufficient, we have to protect the Saudi police state. And we will. We'll go to war if something happens in Bahrain and the Iranians interfere. The Saudis buy billions of dollars of guns, but they can't defend themselves. We'll have to fight the Iranians, which of course is what in some ways the Saudis want, and so do the Israelis.
Do you think there's a possibility of an impending war between Iran and...
I think it really depends on how the Shias are treated in Bahrain. If large numbers of Shias are slaughtered because they demonstrate, I think Iran would have a hard time not coming to the rescue of their co-religionists. And if they do, the pressure on the United States and the interests of our oil, and also the Saudis buy a lot of our debt, I think we'll go and defend them. And then the Israelis will have what they want. They want their war against the United States, and I think it's a disaster for America.
To what extent do you think oil is the driving force for US and NATO intervention in Libya?
Well, I think with the way the economies are, they're certainly part of it. And I'm kind of less concerned about what drove us to do it. I think it could have been a goofy belief that there would be a genocide, which I don't think was possible or was going to happen. But I think we have very tone-deaf politicians, because I think what much of the world is seeing is NATO, the Europeans, and the white guys bombing a Muslim country because it has oil and they want the oil. And I think in the long run it has a very disastrous effect for us. If we had let Gaddafi just sort out his own country, many fewer people would have died. If the idea was humanitarian, it backfired.
Is the idea ever humanitarian or ethical?
For me, it isn't. For me, if in almost all cases, we only make things worse by intervening. I tend to suspect that if we had gone to Rwanda, for example, it would have been much worse for a much longer time. And we intervened recently to strip away a part of South Sudan with most of the oil and give it to a Christian country from a Muslim country. I suspect by the end of the summer we're going to have a war down there. So intervening for humanitarian reasons, it makes your heart feel good, but it's so detrimental both to the people you try to help and to yourself. Certainly more aggressive and more dictating than Bush in terms of how Muslims should behave. Maybe a bit less, for a while, a bit less militarily oriented. But I have to think that the region thinks, well, geez, what interest was there of the United States in Libya? You know,
there was a hesitation at first to intervene.
Yeah, but in a correct one. There's no U.S. interest at stake in Libya. But it must have been, at the end of the day, oil or some other thing that was persuading those people to decide to join the Brits and the French.
I mean, so you think it pretty much follows on from the style of Bush?
I think there's no difference between the two parties in terms of foreign policy in the Middle East. They're not going to do anything about oil. They're going to support the Israelis no matter what the Israelis do. And we're going to continue this democracy mongering, crusading for democracy, no matter who's in power, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, until something happens that hurts the United States so badly that the people at the grassroots level are going to say, what are you doing? And I'm old and I guess cynical, but I'm beginning to believe that nothing changes in America without a calamity. Something disastrous has to happen. And
do you think there's a possibility of an Al-Qaeda attack?
oh, sure. I think the reason they haven't attacked is because they have the best of both worlds at the moment. They're not attacking, which would unite the American population, but they're defeating or helping to defeat 2 American field armies. You know, we're going to pull out of Iraq, we're going to pull out of Afghanistan, and the politicians will dress it up as a victory for the American people. But in the Muslim world, much of the Muslim world is going to say, the second superpower got beaten by people with weapons from the Korean War. How is this possible? And it's going to have a galvanizing effect on the young men of this generation, just as it did when they beat the Soviets on bin Laden's generation. It's a very dangerous thing, and the one thing that's never discussed is what the perception of the Muslim world will be when we run away from Afghanistan with no victory at all.
What do you think?
I think to some extent it will mirror what happened after the Soviets left. You know, bin Laden, when you read his work, the one thing that he was extraordinarily concerned with was a sort of a sense of defeatism in the Muslim world. That Muslims kind of figured, oh, we always get beat by the West, why bother? And I think he was personally surprised that the defeat of the Soviets didn't do more, but I think he clearly wanted us in Afghanistan because he thought, A, we would get beaten because we would run away, and second, he thought that that would be really an antidote for the defeatism of the Muslim world, what he perceived as the defeatism of the Muslim world.
I mean, there hasn't been a major attack at all since 9/11, so you think there is a preparation?
Well, I think there's absolutely an ongoing preparation.
What's the role of the CIA at the moment? I mean,
oh, well, increasingly now, Mr. Obama, Mr. Cameron, Western leaders have cheered to the destruction of the tyrannies, and whether we liked it or not, Egypt, Tunisia, even Gaddafi, and certainly Saleh in Yemen did a lot of counterterrorism work for us. So the role of the agency now, or of MI6, is that they've suddenly got an enormous amount of new work to do, which they're not very qualified to do. So the fall of those dictators has been a disaster for the Western intelligence community.
That's an interesting thing, because many of these people have actually worked for the intelligence to help intelligence.
Yes,
within the region.
very much. We had a common interest against bin Laden, Mubarak, Saleh, the rest of them. And it's a funny thing, but there doesn't seem to be any reflection in American politicians about what you're doing by cheering the destruction of these people. I don't think we should have supported it. I think probably we should have been quiet about it, because our support for a guy like Baradei is just going to make him an untouchable in Egypt. But also, it doesn't seem to me that Obama has given much thought, or McCain for that matter, on the Republican side, to how much more work is now being piled on the U.S. intelligence community.
It was a pleasure, and thank you. I know your time is very restricted.
I'm happy if...
we very much appreciate all your time.
Thank you very much, man.